Following the 2004 disaster, governments of affected countries as well as nations across the Indian Ocean had to reassess their preparedness for future tsunamis in the region to prevent similar levels of devastations and loss of lives. Now, for more, we are joined by Rajib Shah, who's a professor of media and governance at Keio University, speaking to us from Tokyo. Professor Shah, thank you very much for your time. So 2004 Indian Ocean tsunami certainly was a watershed moment that reshaped global disaster risk management. And 20 years on, is it safe to say if a similar earthquake or tsunami were to hit again, are we now in a much better position to mitigate the risks and manage post-disaster response and recovery?
Thank you very much. Indeed, this particular event was one of the milestone event in the whole disaster risk reduction in Asia and also in globally. There have been lots of lessons. We had also several other major disasters over the last 20 years. And I think each disaster taught us very important lessons. I would like to focus on a major change which has been observed in the disaster governance, which is this localization and decentralization of the governance system. As we have seen that Aceh was far from Jakarta, Tamil Nadu in India was far from the national capital. So in this type of disaster events, I think the most important is how this local government and local communities are capable of responding to and the initially recovered from the major disasters. And after these disasters, I think we had two major global frameworks. One is in the following years, in 2005, we called Hyogo Framework for Action. And then in 2015, that was the Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction. And both these global framework focused very strongly on the importance of the local governance, the local community, the local culture, local coping mechanisms, and so on.
Okay, speaking of the localized the concept of things, as we heard from our correspondent just now in his report, indigenous knowledge and local wisdom have long played a crucial role in disaster resilience. What are the best ways for integrating these traditional knowledge with modern scientific approaches to create more effective disaster management strategies?
It's a very, very important thing. Like when we have the indigenous knowledge, there are some of these indigenous knowledge are documented, but some of these are not documented. These are orally transmitted. So we call some of them are very formal indigenous knowledge, which has been practiced, which you can possibly see, maybe some building materials, the building structures. But some of these are also with the folk songs or sometimes with the traditional cultural issues or cultural events and so on. So of course, the education plays a very, very important role. How we can actually, we have seen in the Indonesian example that how this traditional knowledge are taught by the local people in the school. So the school and the local community, I think that interface is very, very important. I have seen that in many other countries, whether it is in the coastal communities, whether it is in the mountain communities, whether it is in the river basin, there are all these different indigenous knowledge. And I personally actually worked very closely with the United Nations to document some of this indigenous knowledge. And we say that indigenous knowledge are there in action in the local level, in the grassroots level. But how at the policy level, we try to recognize them. So we say that from action to policy, that particular linkage. Usually it is the other way around. But for indigenous knowledge, I think the documenting the local indigenous knowledge and linking it with the local education system is extremely, extremely important.
Okay, and Professor, while substantial progress has been made, are there areas where you feel progress has been disappointingly slow?
One of the major challenge is the financing issue. We always say that if you spend $1 now, that saves $7 for the recovery process. That means that it shows the importance of the prevention. Many times we see that there has been huge investment after the disasters, major banks, the national government, the non-government organizations, many different stakeholders, and also the common citizen actually with their voluntary donations. So there have been huge amount of money usually comes after the disasters. But one of the major challenges, how we do more risk-sensitive investment. So, like when we talk about the disaster planning or preparedness, sometimes these are very, very invisible things. Well, we have resilient infrastructures, but it's not just the physical infrastructure. We need to invest in education. We need to invest in the training and capacities of the local communities. We need to invest the voluntarism to develop this voluntarism in different local communities. So I think when you talk about, I still see there are some gaps in the resilient infrastructure investment. One is on the physical part, but also another one is more on the soft investment. I think that part possibly we need to improve a lot.
Okay, and Professor, given the evolving nature of threats such as we've been through pandemics, the climate extremes, what are some of the emerging risks or new or complex threats that should the disaster-prone communities focus more on? And what sort of advice would you give the policymakers and communities in prioritizing the most urgent areas for intervention?
Especially post-pandemic, I think we are now living in a very complex risk landscape, what I say. It's not just one natural hazard which are happening. We need to put the risk into the perspective of a complex risk landscape where there can be a natural hazard, which are the earthquake, tsunami, landslide, typhoon, but there are also biological hazards, what we have seen. Like during the pandemic, we had also many other natural hazards, like there are earthquakes happened, there are typhoon came, there are flooding happened, and so on. So we need to have possibly a new ways of governance, and that's what I talk about, the adaptive governance. So the traditional ways of governance mechanism, the traditional disaster management legislation, regulations, we need some adjustment during this unforeseen situation. So that's one of the very important part of the governance. Another very important part is the education and training. So traditionally, yes, we know that when there is an tsunami or earthquake, you need to evacuate from the coastal area. We have seen this major damage also in 2011, East Japan earthquake and tsunami, that we lost 19,000 plus people. And many other following disasters. But I think how we actually make the proper shelter management, evacuation center management during the disaster in a very complex situation when we had pandemic. So the traditional, again, the approaches was not effective. So say, for example, usually we evacuate people to the schools. But when we evacuate people to the schools during the pandemic, we had to have proper distances between one person to another person. That means the occupancy rate in many of the schools became 40% or 30%. So in that case, we need possibly non-conventional areas, say, for example, community halls or some other larger areas where we need to evacuate people. And for that, some sort of adjustment in the local legislation, local regulation, local ways of taking decision making needs to be changed. And another very important thing which I see in recent days is the evolution of the technology. 20 years back, we had a different technology regime. But now it's not only just the social media, but also many types of disruptive technologies, whether it is AI, whether it is blockchain, whether it is big data analysis, drones. So there are lots of emerging technologies which has been there. So how we effectively use those technology and how we give a proper governance mechanism or governance framework to use of those technologies, I think that's also very, very important.
Okay, Professor, I'm afraid we have to leave it there for now, but thank you very much for talking us through the progress that's being made, also the challenges that we still face as we mark the 20 years since the Indian Ocean tsunami. Thank you for your time. We've been speaking to Rajib, Professor of Media and Governance of Keio University.